The Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was restless that night. When he finally gave up all hope of falling asleep, he got out of bed and walked slowly over to his balcony. A fresh, dry summer breeze welcomed him as he stepped out onto it. He crossed his arms and stood there, looking at the cloudless sky above. It was wonderful, that immense space with all its stars that seemed on a constant mission to defy numbering. Ever since he had been a child, that sky had always intrigued him. He would stay up late, after his bedtime, and watch the starry vault that purposely denied him sleep. When I grow up and become Pharaoh, I will order my men to build the tallest ladder ever built, and I will climb it all the way up to the stars. Now that he was Pharaoh, all he wanted he had at a snap of his fingers, but that beauty was still beyond his reach. He sat in a cozy chair and threw his head back, losing himself in the depths of the sky. A short while later, he was asleep, intoxicated by the jasmine-perfumed summer breeze and the beauty up above. "Oh my God, it's 8:30!" Mary screamed as she jumped out of bed. "I'll never make it on time." She was going to be late for work again, and this time her boss was most definitely going to fire her. It was the fourth time in less than 2 weeks. As she quickly put on her clothes, she thought to herself how tough her life was. So much hard work for so little. 2 years without a single holiday. She stepped into the shop where she worked as a salesgirl and saw it all at once in her boss's angry glance. "Do you know what time it is?" "I am so sorry. Do you think I hired you so that I could stand here and serve clients myself?" "I really am sorry, Mr. Jennings. It will not happen again." "Indeed it won't. I've already phoned the agency, and they are sending someone over. You can collect your wages from Mr. Baldwin. Good day." She collected her money in silence and left. Strangely enough, she was not as upset as she would have thought she would be. As she pushed open the door and walked out into the sunlight, she felt alive for the first time in a long time. She was happy. While she was walking home, she passed by a travel agency, and a particular poster caught her eye. It had a beautiful photo of the pyramids, and it said, "Egypt, live the magic. Meet the pharaohs and cruise the Nile. Only £399. What are you waiting for? Book your holiday now." The last sentence sounded like a command, which she quickly walked in and obeyed. Mary had never really been interested in ancient Egyptian history, nor any history for that matter. But having heard and seen so much about the pyramids on television, she wanted to see them with her own eyes and experience their grandeur firsthand. Her flight was scheduled for the following Monday, and Sunday night she lay awake in bed, too excited to sleep. As the plane landed at Cairo International Airport, Mary looked out of her window. She couldn't wait to step out of the plane and start her adventure. Her holiday package included 2 days in Cairo and Giza, followed by a 6-day, 5-night cruise on the Nile on a 5-star ship. The first day was to be spent mostly running around Giza and Cairo in an almost desperate attempt to see the largest number possible of monuments in the shortest time. Their first stop was the pyramids. Mary was unable to believe her eyes when she saw how huge they were, although the guide had well prepared them for that on the way. Each block of stone weighs around 2.5 tons, he had said, and the greatest of the 3 pyramids, the Pyramid of Cheops, covers an area of about 13 acres and is 147 meters high. Mary stood in front of them, speechless. Who were those people, she thought, who first had the idea of building such a magnificent construction and then had both the genius and the means to actually do so? The group spent the good part of 3 hours at the pyramids, but then it was time to leave. The next attraction was to be the Egyptian Museum, but Mary, to her surprise, refused to leave just yet. "If it is possible, I want a personal guide, at my own expense, to stay with me here and tell me more about these pyramids," she told the tour guide. "But you will miss our visit to the museum, which is no less fascinating than these pyramids." "I know, but I can't get enough of them." "If you want, I can arrange for a special guide to take you tomorrow to see an even older pyramid." "That sounds great, but for today, you can leave me here till sunset." The group went on and left her. For hours she sat there and looked at the pyramids, unable to detach herself from them, and unwilling to deliberately put an end to that almost spiritual experience. Unfortunately, the sun was setting, and it was soon time to leave. The hunting season was over. It had been a great season for the Pharaoh, as he had captured many lions and gazelles, which he had then let loose again in the wild, as was his habit. He had proved his mastery and skill over and over again to his people, as would become a god on earth. Still, despite the festivities given in his honor to celebrate that event, and despite the words of praise he heard from everyone around him, which he knew he well deserved, he felt melancholic. Nothing seemed to help relieve that sense of emptiness that seemed to haunt his nights and days of late. He had everything he could possibly want, and yet he was not happy. Mary's first night in Cairo was, despite her extreme exhaustion, spent almost without any sleep. After various attempts at sleeping, she finally lost hope and walked out onto the balcony of her hotel room. She stood there, enjoying the beautiful summer night for a while, then sat down on a comfortable sofa and leant back to admire the starry sky. It was intoxicating. It was also a reminder of her limitations. As she enjoyed the scene above, her mind wandered again to the wonderful pyramids, to that miracle that stood as a witness to the power of man. Why hadn't she thought of coming here before? Did she have to get fired before she could treat herself to a holiday? She felt very grateful to that hateful boss of hers, who luckily had not considered her 2 years of hard work as reason enough to forgive her 4 delays. After a short while, her exhaustion had the best of her, and she succumbed to sleep. It was a beautiful afternoon. As Mary's boat glided slowly over the surface of the Nile, the water all around it glittered under the touch of the sun's rays. All was very quiet, except for the singing of birds, whose voices she didn't recognize, and that flew high over her boat, then back to the wheat fields that flanked the Nile's banks. The summer breeze that blew was cool and refreshing. Could paradise be any lovelier? As the boat glided on, Mary saw a man standing in the middle of the wheat fields with his arms folded. He was dressed like the pharaohs whose statues she had seen in documentaries on Egypt. He looked straight at her with great curiosity, as if he had never seen a tourist before, and followed her with his eyes as her boat glided past him. When she turned to look at him again, he was gone. She stood up in her boat and turned fully around to look for him, but as she did that, she lost her balance and fell into the water. The fall woke her up. At 7 a.m., Mary got up. As she remembered her dream, a strong feeling of joy filled her heart. She rarely ever dreamt, and never had her dreams been so vivid nor so detailed. But this dream was different. Every single detail was very clear in her head. She could still smell the air, and the strange singing of the birds was still ringing in her ears. Clearest of all, however, was the image of that Pharaoh in the field. She remembered the pride with which he had stood, and the way he had looked at her. In his glance there was more than just curiosity. There was amiability, a desire to make contact. She met her guide at 9, and at 10 they reached Dahshur, where Sneferu's bent pyramid stood. Her interest in ancient Egyptian history seemed to grow with every minute that she spent in Egypt, and that dream was making it even stronger. Why did the pharaohs build those pyramids? She asked Yusuf, her guide. To be their tombs. But surely tombs did not have to be that huge, nor that sophisticated. We are talking about pharaohs, madam. For them, everything, especially those things that had to do with the afterlife, had to be huge and impressive, even though, in the case of pyramids, using them as tombs for the pharaohs meant that they were obvious targets for robbers and mummy snatchers. Yes, that brings me to my next question. Why did they mummify their dead? For an ancient Egyptian, life after death could only be attained if the body had been kept intact after death. Those people whose bodies were not mummified for a reason or another could not hope for eternal life. How grim, she thought. What if something happened to the body? They walked on and stopped in front of the bent pyramid. This might have been the first attempt at building a smooth-sided pyramid, Yusuf said, pointing to it. Sneferu had been inspired by Imhotep's step pyramid, and although this pyramid is far from perfect, it is living proof of his will and determination. He also had another pyramid built, the Red Pyramid. That night, Mary had another dream. Again, she was in a boat that glided smoothly near the shore of the Nile. A full moon shone brightly above her as her boat seemed to float in the direction of a pier. When she reached it, Mary got out and started looking around her. To her surprise, she saw the same wheat fields from her previous dream. She walked towards them, and the farther she walked, the more she felt the urge to keep on walking, as if a secret force were drawing her towards an unknown destination. As she walked on, she could see the silhouette of a man standing not far from her. He seemed to notice her, and started to walk in her direction. Her heart beat fast. When he was close enough, she realized it was the same Pharaoh from the previous dream. Something about him was very attractive. His gait was proud but not vain, and the harmony of his features made her wish she could keep looking at his face forever. His large dark eyes shone with intelligence, and though he was not very robust, he was by no means lacking in strength. He looked at her closely, with a friendly smile on his face. He then took her hand in his and walked with her deeper into the fields. She had no idea where they were going, but she felt safe and happy. As they walked on, she heard a noise that kept growing stronger and stronger. It sounded like someone was knocking at a door. The last knock woke her up with a start. It was the tour leader. She had overslept and was going to miss her flight to Aswan. As the passengers enjoyed their lunch, the Horus glided smoothly on the surface of the Nile. Mary had taken her plate and gone out on the deck to enjoy the scenery. It reminded her of her dream and of the Pharaoh, but there were no wheat fields in sight, and most of all, no Pharaoh. Everything she had seen so far had been more than beautiful, and she was looking forward to every new phase of her journey. Surprisingly, however, what had touched her the most were those strange, vivid, almost real dreams that she had started having ever since she had arrived in Egypt. In fact, she was worried that perhaps that night she wouldn't dream of her Pharaoh again. The days, though filled with beautiful new places to visit, seemed to have tripled in length, and she wished the nights would never end. She didn't know why she was dreaming like that, but whatever the reason was, she hoped they would never stop. If I have one of those dreams again, I will talk to him this time, she said to herself. I must at least ask him his name. I must. She went to bed that night, repeating these last words out loud, as if by doing so she would force herself to have that dream and force the course of the dream to follow her will. She fell asleep repeating them. Get me the Minister of Commerce, the Pharaoh ordered his vizier. What, now? It is almost midnight, Your Majesty, Khagemna remarked. Snefru didn't answer. It was true. He was not used to making strange demands of that sort, but indeed he was not used as well to having to explain a demand, not even to his Grand Vizier, who was also his blood relative. The look he gave Khagemni, though, was clearer than the clearest answer that Snefru could have given, and 1 hour later the minister was kneeling in front of him. Your Majesty has sent for me. I beg to be of service. Get up, Netnebu, and sit here in front of me. I need your full attention." The minister was astonished by the Pharaoh's uncommon demand. He was not used to seeing his king like that. "You have been to the land of Amuru and of Punt. You have seen their people. Tell me, what are they like?" "In what way, your majesty?" Sneferu smiled. His minister had to be wondering at his Pharaoh's strange question. "Physically, I mean. What do they look like?" "Well, the people of Punt resemble a great deal your subjects who live in the south of your lands, majesty." "And those of Amuru?" "Well, they are slightly taller than us, their skin is fairer, and their hair is smoother and tends to curl in a funny way. They do not wear wigs, and—" Yes, but what color are their eyes?" the Pharaoh interrupted him. "Why, brown, of course, like ours." The king reluctantly asked, "Haven't you seen anyone whose eyes were the color of sapphire?" The minister was bewildered. "Majesty, I have never seen, nor indeed ever heard, of such a thing. Perhaps it might be the symptom of some strange sort of eye disease." "Maybe," the Pharaoh said, "maybe," more to himself than to the minister, whom he excused with a simple, "That is all for now." Left alone, he sat in his room and thought about her whose eyes were the color of sapphire. What strange fantasy had made him dream of that, if indeed it were a fantasy? Those dreams didn't feel like any other dreams he had ever had. And he was not a frequent dreamer. He seemed to be more conscious during those dreams than he was when fully awake. His great-grandfather had the gift of interpreting dreams. How he wished he had the same gift, for maybe then he would be able to explain who that strangely beautiful woman was, and why she was visiting his nights. Was she a supernatural being, a messenger of the gods, and was he going to see her again that night? Indeed, he was starting to feel burdened by the long hours of the day, and as soon as darkness fell, he went to bed in the hope of re-experiencing those wonderful dreams. "If again tonight I dream of her, then I must talk to her. I must, the Pharaoh said, and kept repeating that sentence till he fell asleep. It was a moonlit night. Mary was standing in front of the gate of a palace. The path that led to the gate had strange beasts on either side that looked like lions but had the heads of rams, and that stood motionless but alert, protecting the entrance. Mary was frightened by their sight. She wanted to get into the palace, but those creatures terrified her. Then suddenly she saw the palace gate open, and the Pharaoh came out through it. He walked right on towards her, as if the beasts didn't exist, and as he passed, he signed to them to sit, and instantly they obeyed. When he reached her, he took her by the hand and led her through the gate to the palace garden. All her fear had vanished, and the only feeling that she had at that moment was pure happiness. The gates closed, and he turned to her and smiled, then said, "Welcome, dear unknown friend." Instead of asking him his name, as she had planned, she found herself saying, "I hope this moment will never end, but it always ends so fast." "Then make haste and tell me who you are." "My name is Mary. I come from Great Britain." "Mary, Mary, so beautiful. But what is that country you come from called again? I have never heard of it." "Great Britain, it is in Europe. But who are you?" "Europe? Where is that?" he was saying, as she was asking him the last question. "I am Sneferu, king of Kemet." "It's beyond the Mediterranean Sea." They both spoke at the same time. Then they both laughed. "Oh my God, you are that Pharaoh," she said. "Beyond the sea? You mean beyond the Uat Ur, the great green, I suppose," he said. Yes, beyond what? Oh, she repeated. How lovely these words sounded to her. I see, he said, and then, as if he had just heard her earlier comment, what do you mean, that Pharaoh? The one who built the first smooth-sided pyramid, almost 4,600 years before my birth. The Pharaoh gaped, and then asked her to describe that pyramid to him, which she did. She was about to tell him more when she heard music. It was a waltz of Chopin. Oh no, it's happening again. He knew it too. The dream was ending. I want to see you again, she said. Then it shall be, he said, authoritatively, as if he could control anything he wanted. The music kept growing louder and louder till she opened her eyes. It was her mobile phone ringing. She was awake, and the first word that she pronounced was Sneferu. His first word when he opened his eyes was Mary. The next morning, the Pharaoh walked back and forth in his room. He had never been so restless in his entire life before. Something was telling him that those dreams were more than just that. He knew it in his heart. Her words kept ringing in his ears, about her name, about her faraway land beyond the great green, but most of all, about the pyramid. How could she have known? She had said he had built the first pyramid. She had described not the pyramid of Zoser, but the one he had been planning and studying for so long, and had till then been unable to build. How did she know that? Was it true? She came from the future? So many questions filled his mind, but there was no one he could share them with. No one would understand, and they would think the Pharaoh was touched by some evil spirit. He had been planning on building a pyramid that was different, like no one had ever created before. The pyramid of Zoser was formidable, but it was not perfect. What he had in mind, however, was not proving easy to design. For long months he and his architects had stayed up late, working on the plans, and discussing the difficulties which at a point had seemed so overwhelming that he had decided to lay the whole project aside for a while. But now she comes and tells him his project was a success. And not just so, it had withstood the test of time, if indeed he was to believe those dreams. Standing 4,600 years after his death, how could that be? Having exhausted his mind all day, he decided to go to bed early in the hope of meeting her again. As soon as she got up, Mary grabbed her mobile phone and started to Google Sneferu. What she was looking for, first of all, was a picture of him, of one of his statues, that is. The first one she found was a huge disappointment. It looked nothing like her Pharaoh from the dream. She then remembered that more often than not, great people of the past had more than one depiction, and that people were never really sure of how they looked. It was only as she opened the third picture that her heart jumped. In front of her was the face of the man she had been seeing in her dreams, only now it was rigid, hard, unsmiling. Now more than ever, she felt she needed to know about Sneferu, about his life, his character, and though the net could not satisfy her fully, she spent the day studying every site that mentioned him. It was early morning. Mary stood in front of a temple. There was no one else there. Then she heard someone call her name and turned to see the Pharaoh approach her with a smile on his face. "We meet again," he said. "I wasn't sure it would happen," she answered. "Nor was I," he admitted. He then looked at her closely, as if by doing so he could tell if she were real or the result of his own imagination. He then said, more to himself than to her, "It is not easy for me to believe that you really are from the future." "Yes, and that you are from the past," she said. Then they both laughed. "Most people would do anything to be able to talk to a pharaoh," she said. "Who is the ruling pharaoh at your time?" he asked. She couldn't hold herself back from laughing. "There are no pharaohs now, nor have there been for over 2,500 years. The pharaoh looked bewildered. He wanted to ask her so many questions, but he knew they had little time. He looked at her kindly and smiled. He really liked her, and she knew it, as one knows such things in a dream. There was no need for words. He took her by the hand and walked. As they walked on, Sneferu said, "There are 1,000 things that I wish to ask you, but time is never on our side. Let me at least ask this before it ends. If it were up to you, would you choose to live in your time or mine?" The question was no surprise to her. In fact, that was all that she had been thinking ever since the dreams had started. "In your time, on one condition, though," she answered. He looked at her closely and asked, "What is that?" "That I be near you," she said. He smiled and pressed her hand to his heart. He then looked her deep in the eyes and said, "Do you think I would let you be in any other place?" Then he added, "I believe that for every good deed that one does in this life, there is another good deed done to them. In this lifetime, then again and again and again in the next. You are one of my good deeds," he said. "I am just a simple person, and—" He interrupted her. "That is not what I see in your eyes, but it is not just for this that I thank you." Before he could finish his sentence, they felt the sun disappear. They were waking up, and this dream too was ending. He looked at her anxiously, and she at him. They both wondered how much longer those dreams would last. No one could have the answer to that. But Mary almost knew for sure that if she left Egypt, then probably she would never meet her Pharaoh again. Yusuf, the tour guide, stood in front of the avenue of ram-headed lions of the temple of Karnak and started telling the group about that great temple. The avenue of ram-headed sphinxes leads towards the massive front of the first pylon of the temple of Karnak. The temple itself covers an area of 1,500 meters by 800 meters. Its main entrance is lined by the ram-headed sphinxes, though most of them are missing their heads these days. A very long time ago, the avenue linked the temple of Karnak and the temple of Luxor, and everyone was listening attentively and examining closely those strange-looking sphinxes, except for Mary. She was with them only physically, while her mind had wandered off to her dreams. This was not her first time to see these sphinxes. She had seen them in her dream, only then they were alive and frightening. Any doubt that she might have had in her heart had now disappeared. Never had she heard of, or indeed imagined, the existence of such a thing as an avenue of ram-headed lions. Even when she did see them in her dream, she thought they were a figment of her own imagination, a strange detail like all those strange things that in our dreams we see and accept as normal. But now they stood in front of her, real and solid. She did meet him then. It was no fantasy. Her happiness and excitement were only equalled by that sense of fear that those encounters with her Pharaoh might end at any time, as surely and as abruptly as they had started. She had no idea what it was that had caused them to start. But what did she care? They were the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to her, and she knew that her life was never going to be the same again. Sneferu sat alone in the palace garden and thought about Mary. How wonderful it would have been if he could somehow bring her over to his time. No force on earth could do that, he knew. He felt suffocated by that limitation, just like he did when he looked at the sky. It was at those times that he felt human, weak, and helpless. When he rode his chariot in battle, when he went hunting, when he ruled, he was the Pharaoh. But when he looked at the sky and craved to reach those stars, he knew he was no god. And now with Mary, he knew he could never really reach her. It was frustrating. Finally, very reluctantly, he called his chief priest and told him about the dreams. "Majesty, if they make you happy, then they are good dreams," Pharaoh said. Sneferu was not satisfied with that flattering, evasive answer. "Can you tell me if indeed I meet that woman from the future?" "Why, my lord, I do not think anyone can know that for sure." "But I told you she knows about the pyramid. She knows such details as only I myself know." The priest looked puzzled. He didn't want to say anything that might provoke the Pharaoh's anger. And indeed, he had noticed how that matter seemed to be of such great importance to Sneferu. But how could he know? Then a question came to his mind. "Majesty, what language do you speak in the dream?" The Pharaoh looked surprised. He had never given that any thought before. "I had never thought about that," he said. "I am not sure, but now that I think of it, it doesn't seem to me that we use any language at all." "You mean you read each other's thoughts?" Pharaoh asked. "Yes, I do believe so," the Pharaoh said in a low, uncertain voice. The priest was no less confused than his Pharaoh, so he said, "Majesty, there is no one who could equal your might, nor your wisdom. If it appears to you that that woman comes from the future, then it must be so. You cannot be wrong." Although Sneferu was only too aware of the priest's desire to please him, he couldn't disagree with him. He knew they were not dreams. He knew, and that was enough. But now he also wanted to act. "There is something which I want you to do for me," he said to the priest. Pharaoh looked worried. "What is that, your majesty?" "I will explain, but first sit down and give me your full attention. This is going to be your most difficult task ever." The fifth night in Egypt was no different from the previous four. As soon as Mary was asleep, she found herself in sight of Sneferu's red pyramid at the shore. He was standing, looking at it with his back to her. Then he spoke to her without turning, as if he knew she was standing behind him. "You were right. It does exist. You do exist. It is all true." She walked over to him and stood beside him. He turned to her and, without speaking, held her close to his heart and kissed her. Then he said, "I want to thank you, Mary. You have cured my heart of an illness which no one else could cure." She couldn't understand. "Do you see this pyramid here? It might not have existed if it hadn't been for you," he said. This only made her even more puzzled. She looked at him inquisitively. "You told me I had built the first real pyramid, and you described the one that I and my architects had been striving to realize. To tell you the truth, I had started giving up hope on it. My plans had failed with the pyramid at Meidum, but now I have resumed work on them, and this time I know it will be a success," he said as he looked at his pyramid. "I'm so flattered, so happy," she said, but then her eyes filled with tears. The Pharaoh looked at her sympathetically and said, "Do happy people weep?" She looked at him and didn't speak. He knew the reason for her tears. "We have been granted a great gift by the gods. We shouldn't ask for more. What is meant to be will be, and we, even I, have no power in the face of that." Somehow his words had soothed her. She felt she had been greedy. She knew she should be grateful for that great experience, and to want for it to last would be simply absurd. Thank you, dear Mary. You cannot imagine what all this means to me." The Pharaoh was pleased, but strangely, though no tears filled his eyes, his heart was also sad. "I go back to my country the day after tomorrow. I don't know if I will still see you in my sleep." "Can't you stay?" "What will I do? Where will I live? I know no one here, and I am not rich." The Pharaoh looked upset. Then he said quickly, before the dream was over, "Mary, listen, I want to give you something." Mary was astonished. "Give me? But how?" she asked. "I've spoken to my chief priest. He is capable of things that are usually beyond most people's imagination." "Do you mean that he can send me something from your time?" "Yes, I do believe it to be possible. You don't know what our—" He stopped short in his sentence and said, "But I am wasting time. Please, let me finish first. You know how time is our enemy. I wish to give you a golden bracelet with sapphires the color of your eyes and with your name engraved on it." Mary could not understand how. "It will be placed near the pyramid of Zoser, and only you will be able to find it. But please let me finish before we wake. This might be our last encounter. Tomorrow the moon will be full. You must go to the northern side of the pyramid of Zoser at night, alone." "And then?" she asked. "And then a sign will show you the place of the bracelet." "What sort of sign?" she asked. "I do not know yet, but you will find it. This much I have been assured of," he said, and as he said it, he started fading. They both realized the dream was ending. They looked at each other with eyes full of sadness. Then it was all dark. The dream had ended. The next day, Mary prepared herself to leave the ship. The plane which was to take them back to Cairo was to take off at 2 in the afternoon from Aswan airport. All the happiness that Mary had experienced during her brief stay in Egypt seemed to have been turned into misery. The thought of never seeing her Pharaoh again was depressing, painful, and cruel. She would have to be content with his stone statues and his pyramid, but she remembered his words, and that made her stronger. For the first time in her life, however, Mary was unable to think straight. If she did not leave Egypt, would her dreams continue? What would she do for a living? She knew no one in Egypt. She didn't know the language. She could go back to England, make some money, then come back to Egypt for a while. But would her dreams resume? Maybe it was some sort of a magic spell, and it would break if she ever left. One thing she was sure of, however, she was not going to leave before the moon was full. Mary got out of the taxi and told the driver to wait for her. "I will be right back," she said. "Do not leave, please." Mary was shivering all over. The excitement of the experience and the fear of being alone at night at that deserted place made her heart beat quickly and unsteadily. She approached the side of the pyramid of Zoser that faced north and stopped. Although there was a full moon, she could not see very well, and she was not even sure what it was that she was looking for. The Pharaoh had said there would be a sign, but what? Then suddenly, from the middle of nowhere, Mary saw an owl land on the first step of the pyramid, then fly down to the ground in front of it. It stood there for a few seconds, then scratched the ground with its claw before flying away back to the middle of nowhere, just as it had come. Mary took out a pocket torch she had in her bag and pointed it towards that spot. She thought she saw something glitter half hidden in the sand. She walked over to it, bent down, and removed more of the sand. To her utter amazement, she saw a beautiful gold bracelet inlaid with sapphires that bore some hieroglyphic inscriptions. With shivering hands, she pulled it out and dusted it off. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever seen. She rolled up her sleeve and slipped in her hand. No sooner had she done that than the sapphires started glowing so strongly that she was unable to look at them. For a moment she and the bracelet flickered like a candle in the wind. Then it stopped and all was quiet. 30 minutes later, the cab driver had had enough of waiting. He came looking for his client, but though he searched the whole area, she was nowhere to be found. The chief priest begged humbly to be excused for waking up the Pharaoh at such a late hour, but since it was a matter of great urgency, and no doubt of immense importance to the Pharaoh, he thought it couldn't wait till the following morning. "What is it, Sahuri? What can you possibly want at this hour of night?" "Majesty, I have successfully carried out the task you had ordered me." "Do you mean the bracelet has been delivered to Mary?" the Pharaoh asked, trying to assume a normal tone and hide his excitement. "Something like that." The Pharaoh was puzzled. "What does that mean?" "The lady has received her gift, your Majesty," Sahuri replied. Then, with a cunning smile on his face and in a subdued voice, he added, bowing slightly in front of his Pharaoh, "I think you might wish to judge for yourself just how well it becomes her."